Before we begin today's episode, I just wanted to preview by saying that this week's episode is a little different and that I was given the great pleasure to interview the director of the film, And So It Begins, which opened in Taiwan at the International Human Rights Film Festival. Now, there was no way that I could fit our whole interview into a Tales episode. However, that doesn't mean that you can't hear it all. If you would like to hear, I think half of this interview got cut. If you would like to hear the whole uncut interview and everything that we discuss, which I would highly recommend, you can head over to rti.org and listen at the RTI Studio program. I hope you enjoy this episode, and without further ado, let's get into it.
A tale of our time, that's ever changing, I think, because especially in the age of social media and so much communication and information coming at you, it really is what attracts the zeitgeist, I think. And that's always different daily, you know. But I would think right now, because I am in the midst of releasing this film, the tale of my time right now, and I won't commit to it being forever. So right now, it is, I think, the story of big tech and disinformation and how that really affects our daily lives. Especially, I think, the younger generation. I would say like Gen Z and the Alpha?
Yeah, Gen Alpha, right
Gen
after
Alpha,
Gen Z, right?
Yeah, after Z is Alpha. I think it really, but it's part of their DNA too, right? So it's hard to say how it's affecting them because I think they're smarter about social media than we are, than boomers who didn't grow up with it and millennials who barely had it, right?
Right. Welcome, everyone, to Tales of Our Time. This is a show where we discuss the stories that move us, what makes them so meaningful, and why others could or should find meaning in them as well. This is not a spoiler-free show, so bear that in mind as you continue to listen. We tackle books, movies, documentaries for today, and more. I'm your host, Amanda Stevens, and joining me today is a very special guest, Miss Ramona Diaz. Welcome to the show.
Oh, my pleasure. It's great. Thank you for having me.
Really, thank you for agreeing to, sit in and join us. So, Ramona, you, of course, are a woman of many accomplishments. So, how would you prefer to introduce yourself?
Gosh, I am Ramona Diaz. I'm a filmmaker. I've been making films for 20 years. I live in the U.S., but I always go back to the Philippines to make my films. I think every film I make is a yearning to understand the motherland more.
Yeah.
I live in this liminal space, the in-between space between the U.S. and the Philippines, which is a great place to live in as a documentary filmmaker, as an observer.
So today, of course, we're discussing your newest documentary, which is And So It Begins. So usually I would have our guest give us a summary, but since I just saw it yesterday, I'm going to give my own hand at giving a summary of And So It Begins and trying not to give away the end for once, but I feel like the message of this one is powerful and it's still in theaters in the Philippines, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
I would hate to give it away to anyone who hasn't yet seen the film. Now, first things first, And So It Begins is it's related to another documentary you made about Filipino journalist Maria Ressa called 1,000 Cuts. Is that correct?
We call it a companion film.
Yes.
Because it's not really a sequel. The idea is that you can watch And So It Begins without ever having seen 1,000 Cuts. That's the whole idea. People hate sequels to documentaries. So we call it a companion film.
Yeah. I mean, I asked this because I haven't seen 1,000 Cuts yet. But I do understand, like, if you had seen the two of them, you might find some kind of continuity between them. But yes, it's not a direct sequel. And so some groundwork first, some things that you should know. The beginning of this film is something that happened in 2016. The film mostly takes place in 2022. But in 2016, the movie begins by telling us that in the Philippines, the president and the vice president are elected separately. And so in the 2016 election, they were elected from opposite tickets, which resulted in a man many of us know, Duterte, becoming president of the Philippines, and a woman named Leni Robredo becoming the vice president of the Philippines. Presidents in the Philippines are also limited to a 6-year term. Come 2022, there will be a new presidential election, and the vice president, Leni Robredo, throws her hat in the ring as a candidate to become the next president of the Philippines. So It Begins follows the political campaign of Leni Robredo, juxtaposed against her opponent, a man named Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who is the son of the late dictator of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Sr. And we see these two campaigns, Leni's, which is one built by Hope, which is one that is really filling the movement and filled with a lot of grassroots support and pulling support from the people that she meets independently, and that of Marcos Jr., who is building upon both his father's empire, but more importantly, perhaps the disinformation campaign that has been at work underground ever since that empire ended. And we see the energy between these two as they shape where the country might be headed in the future. Commenting on all of this, and as kind of a companion in this same documentary, we also have more of a story of Maria Ressa, who many of you have probably seen because she won a Nobel Peace Prize, which we do get to see that moment in the documentary. That was very heartwarming. And Maria Ressa and her media company, I seem to have not written down the name of it. Thank you so much. Rappler are in a lot of hot water in the Philippines constantly because what they're doing is trying to expose the corruption that is in the Duterte campaign, not campaign, but in the Duterte administration. And they're silenced as they're constantly trying to get the news out, trying to spread the truth of what's going on and trying to combat disinformation and the many ways that is complex and complicated by a regime that doesn't want you to be doing that, by sexism, by misogyny, and also by how fast information moves on the internet. And if it sounds like there's a lot of things that are happening in this documentary, that's because there are. And you're kind of watching this really movement as it goes through the Philippines in 2022, 2021, finally ending in the election night, which I don't want to say. If you know politics, you know how it ended, but it would be good for you to sit and watch. And what happens after that and kind of where the movement might go, but we don't actually see because this is just a slice of life in the Philippines. This isn't an answer. This isn't a happy ending. This is just one story to be told. And so it begins. When it comes to questions, something I want to ask you that I think is impossible to get across in our conversation is that your documentary is very musical and the campaign is very musical. There are songs, there are bespoke songs using Leni's name. I think the one that made me laugh the most was Lenny B. So I wanted to ask you, are campaigns in the Philippines really that musical? Is that something that was selected for your documentary, or is it somewhere in between?
It is always full of spectacle. Elections in the Philippines are like nothing else you've ever seen anywhere else, I feel. It is full of entertainment.
Yeah.
It's full of music and song and dance, like what you see. In 1,000 Cuts, we touch upon that also because that was set against the backdrop of the midterms. As Maria Ressa was getting arrested in 1,000 Cuts.
Yeah.
That was a time when midterms were happening. So in a way, the political is also there, the political backdrop.
Of course.
Yes, it's always been full of spectacle. I think the intersection between entertainment and politics in the Philippines has always been there. We've had one president who was actually an action star.
Oh,
Joseph Estrada.
Wow.
He was like, the box office king. He was a big action star, and he became president.
Wow.
But especially in the Philippines, it's full of song, dance, hope. They love to put love stories, together,
Yes.
like the narrative of, say, a politician with his wife singing, and that's what we call a love team. And people like to believe in those things. And is it a distraction from the real policies? Perhaps.
Yeah.
Right? Because you'd rather be entertained than really talk about policy and what you're going to do for the country. Because I think Leni says it in the film, Leni Robredo says it in the film, whenever election time comes around, politicians come and say, well, we
love poor people.
Yeah, we love poor people.
We love you.
But only when it's, election time. But are you really around, when when the election's over?
Where's the proof?
Yeah.
So I learned a lot about the Philippines when I was watching this documentary. I am constantly learning about politics around the world. And one thing that interested me was I didn't know that the Philippines was under martial law in a time so recent.
Yeah.
The martial law was just from 1972 to 1986.
Correct. Yeah.
And
nominally it was no longer under martial law in 86. I think he lifted martial law in
like a little before that.
Before that. He could lift it because all the institutions were in place to serve him, right?
Right.
So it was a nominal lifting of martial law. But just to be accurate, it wasn't completely we weren't under martial law for that entire time. But it didn't matter at that point anymore because everything was under his control.
Perhaps he used martial law to get everything to the point that he had wanted at the time. And this is all for that man I mentioned previously, Ferdinand Marcos Sr. And so we do hear some voices from people in the film, though none of them are pictured, because it is kind of like a backdrop to this story. It's not the main focus. But I wanted to ask you if there was any kind of personal history there for you as well, if not for you, then anyone in your family that informed your views of that period of time in the Philippines.
I was born and raised under martial law. I am what you call a martial law baby.
Wow.
When living in the Philippines, that's all I ever knew. President Marcos as president. I knew no other president.
Yeah.
Aside from President Marcos. I mean, in my, when I was cognizant of
course.
Life around
Once
me.
you become aware of like what's a president, it's that guy.
And it had always been President Marcos and his wife Imelda. The famous first lady with the shoes. So that was life growing up. Life growing up was about curfews and travel bans and just military presence in the beginning. That went away, as time went by. But I remember waking up that morning when martial law was declared. And it's so quiet on the streets. And as a matter of fact, a lot of the older generation, my parents, for example, said maybe martial law is good because, of course, there's it's like the train's running on time.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I remember the stillness and seeing soldiers on just everywhere in the streets.
Like on the corners and the shops, at the metro stations, all these big places where people would gather normally.
Yeah. But someone said, a journalist described it as a silence of the grave.
Yeah.
Almost. So it's not really, it's
not a peaceful
very scary.
Quiet. Yeah.
It's not the peaceful silence.
No.
Tranquil. It wasn't that way. It was menacing, the silence.
A quiet under threat, right?
Yeah.
I always like to ask that question, mostly because like for somebody like me, I identify as like a millennial. A lot of people who are my age, I think, have kind of a disconnect to those time periods because we were fortunate enough, most of us, to grow up in a time just after that had finished. Right. And so I think it's important to keep kind of like bringing it back up that like it's actually very recent history. And there are probably a lot of people around you who you may not expect that have stories to tell of where that was the governing force for good and for bad. And also, to investigate stories around that.
But I feel like it's happening again, right? Now the pendulum has shifted again. There are more dictatorships in the world than there are democracies. So at this time, right? I don't know the exact number. Maria Ressa should know. She always says
would
it,
know,
and I should know by now. But it is a time of the rise of authoritarianism.
Yeah.
That's why it's really interesting to see what will happen in the U.S., right? That is, I think, pivotal.
Well, that was actually something I wanted to ask you about as well, because there was some parts of it that were chilling for me as somebody who votes in the United States and whose family lives in the United States, particularly when we were learning about Ferdinand Marcos Sr. Ever since they left the Philippines, there has been a disinformation campaign kind of aimed at like a rewriting of history. And the moment that stuck out to me was when we visit his mansion, which is now turned into a museum, which could be good, could be bad, but the way that the museum is billed is definitely in a flattering light. And the phrase that stuck out to me was his campaign slogan, I think it was called, which was, "This country will be great again." Speaking to that, after working really closely on this documentary about this really charged election Do you see any patterns reemerging now, especially as somebody who does spend time or who often lives in the United States?
I mean, this film has become more and more relevant in the U.S., right? We premiered at Sundance in January, and people already started seeing the similarities because, right, Marcos, as you said, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., one of his main mantras was "Make this country great again."
Yeah.
And that's very obviously very similar to
the MAGA movement.
Same as MAGA, right? Which tells me that all these people, authoritarians or want to be authoritarians, are just using one playbook.
Yeah.
Right? Over and over again. They have this playbook that they go to and they look at others in the world who are the other dictators. And
they kind of take notes off of each other's tests, so to speak.
Exactly. And then, of course, Kamala Harris decides to run on this sort of really positive campaign and the energy that created. So, of course, then it became even more relevant because obviously Leni Robredo,
her campaign is also so full of joy and like
ran on joy and hope and roses.
Yes.
So, it became more and more relevant even. And so much so that a lot more film festivals in the U.S. are picking it up ever since Kamala ran, which is so interesting.
Yeah.
Always. But I think what I've found to be true is that hope is as contagious as all the lies and the negative things on social media.
Yeah.
I think people tend to get exhausted by all the lies and the misogyny and the vulgar language. That's exhausting. So I think, in your quiet times, in all our quiet times, right, we revert back, or we're more drawn to poetry and positivity and hope.
Yeah.
At least I think. Well, we'll see. We'll see. As you know, it didn't end up that way in the Philippines, but
and we're not sure where it's going to go. You can spoil it. I just didn't want to say it because it's in theaters. But I'm sure people who check politics already know.
Yeah.
But I go on this show all the time just telling people to like spill the end. So,
it's unfortunate. I mean, she did lose.
Yeah.
Which for many reasons she lost.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm always there's always pushback when they see my film because people say, you don't talk about the cheating and all that. And that's a big thing. Even Leni Robredo herself doesn't talk about the cheating because she says, I don't want to be Trump and talk about the cheating all the time.
Yeah.
I believe there's cheating. There's always cheating. It's But she lost by 14 million votes. So I think they can steal 4 million. They cannot steal 14 million.
Right.
I think it's harder to reckon with the fact he won because you have to start from scratch. You have to figure out why people voted for him and try to change their minds. It's behavioral change. That's harder work than saying, well, we were cheated.
And it was not fair. Right.
Yeah, and it wasn't fair. That's actually the easier road. The harder road is to face the fact and what are we going to do about it?
Yeah.
Because that's education, that's behavioral change, that's more difficult. Anyway, we can go on forever.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, and it is really a shame because I could just keep talking about this with you forever. I would like to end by asking you, where would you recommend that people go see your film, And So It Begins? Hello, everyone. This is Amanda from the future again, jumping in here to tell you where you can go to see And So It Begins. There were a couple of screenings that we forgot to mention during the original recording. So if you are in the United States, there will be selected screenings in San Francisco, LA, and New York. Although some other smaller agencies have asked for independent screenings, so keep your eyes open. Other known film festivals that they are currently scheduled for in October are the Berlin Dokumental in Germany, the Hawaii International Film Festival, the Boston Asian American Film Festival, and the Montclair, New Jersey Film Festival, with one more in November in Warsaw, Poland, at Major Retrospective. And if you are still here in Taiwan, you can look at the International Human Rights Film Festival for the Taichung Gaoshun showings and for when they release it online for a limited time.
But aside from that, we're going to be on television, broadcast television next year, though. I mean, like May 2025. So it's going to be a long time. But meanwhile, we're going to have screenings all around.
But that's all the time that we have today. Really, again, thank you so much. It has been a pleasure to talk to you. And, well, for you out there listeners, this has been Tales of Our Time here on Radio Taiwan International. And we've been talking today with Ramona Diaz, the director, writer, and producer of And So It Begins, Tale of Our Time. We'll see you next time.